Good morning, everybody. My name is Jessie Beckett, and we are going to get started here. Welcome to the crop planning webinar for CCOF. Really excited to have all of you guys on the line. Thank you so much for signing up, and I apologize if there were a lot of hoops to jump through. We're still working out our webinar registration techniques, and I apologize if there were an insane amount of emails, but I got a lot of emails questioning how people should sign up. So thank you for making it into this virtual space. I have here today two amazing presenters that we're really excited to learn with. Ned Conwell, who's actually virtually dialing in from Petaluma, California. Ned has been farming organically for about the last decade. He started a pretty well-known mid-sized organic farm, Blue House Farm in Pescadero, which served the greater Bay Area through its CSA, farmers markets, retail, and wholesale. And over the last year, he's been starting a new operation, open field farm up in Petaluma. And he has made the decision, along with his lovely wife, Rachel, to move to New Mexico, where her parents farm, and they will be starting another operation there. So he's got lots of experience in getting farms up and running and implementing successful crop plans. Our other presenter here today is Doug O'Brien. Doug's got a Ph.D. in plant pathology from UC Davis and an MS as well in plant pathology from UC Berkeley. And he currently owns and operates a consulting company called Doug O'Brien Agricultural Consulting, which provides on-site technical advice, field monitoring, and research for clients involved in fresh produce, growing, harvesting, cooling, and marketing. And he's an adjunct professor in Santa Cruz at Cabrillo College, and he teaches organic food production 1 and 2. He's also previously co-owner of an organic production produce brokering company, as well as a crop production manager and an assistant farm advisor. So thank you all for being here today. Real briefly, we're just going to talk about how to participate today in the webinar. It's kind of this strange new technology that more and more of us are learning on. So the company that we're using today is called WebEx, and they've got it pretty nailed. But feel free to ask questions along the way if you have questions. All right. So moving on. So how to participate today. You can open and close your panel for better viewing so that you can see the whole screen and open and close that panel. You can also raise your hand as well as in this box right here, the raise your hand is midway through, and in the lower box is a question and answer. Please do feel free to submit questions and answers, and I see some question and answers coming in right now. If you cannot hear me, well, I guess you wouldn't be able to hear me if you can't hear me. I'm getting some questions about calling in. You should be both calling in and or hearing me through your computer, or you will be mute. So if you call in via the virtual teleconferencing system, you'll be able to talk during the presentation and answer questions. All right, and we do encourage you to ask questions. We'll have question and answer slides throughout the presentation, and raise your hand if you have a specific question throughout the presentation. I'll do my best to call on those people who have questions. So we're going to start off with Doug O'Brien. Take it away, Doug.
All right, well, thanks for having me today, and welcome, everyone. Whole farm crop planning is really a bit like a business plan with each crop and enterprise. Nick's going to go into the specifics, and I'm going to give you a kind of an overview. And like any basic plan, any basic business plan, we start out by identifying the opportunities we have really to make some money. The resources, we take stock of our resources, and then we plan for long-term sustainability. And when I think about crop planning, the thing that really comes to mind is long-term planning for soil health. So we'll talk about that as well. But basically, we have opportunities and we have our resources, and we put them together in the ideal way, and we end up with a profitable farm and a profitable crop plan. So consolidate all this information, opportunities, resources, and soil health, and it leaves us with the crops we want to grow and growing what we can sell. So the opportunities, let's start with that. Basically, what can you sell and what can you grow? And those two are not the same thing. For example, consider what you can sell. We have restrictive farmers markets, especially here in Santa Cruz, where there are many, many farmers and not enough markets, and it's very difficult to get into them. And if you get in, there's only a few crops that you're limited in selling. Sometimes there's saturated local production, so that you need to go outside your area to produce, and if you've got highly perishable stuff, you may not be able to transfer and still have it fresh. Things like quarantines can also get in the way. There's a big citrus quarantine going on in California right now, and that's going to influence people and what they can grow. Another problem with things you can grow but things you can't sell, chronically low prices. A couple of examples would be generally North American apples. Broccoli is a crop that it's very difficult to sell profitably year in and year out on a wholesale market, for example. Sometimes your market is too small, and sometimes there's too much competition. So there are a lot of cases where there's things we can grow, but we simply can't sell them. Well, let's consider another opportunity, which is what can you grow? And I think it's important not to push your soil and climate too hard. You know, you need to match your crops to what they need, and if you try and jam a crop into a climate and soil that it really isn't very comfortable with, you're not going to have long-term success. Example around here would be cauliflower. Outside of the coastal California or coastal Salinas, Watsonville area here in California, cauliflower is just very difficult to grow to end up with perfect quality. You can get something that looks like a cauliflower, but it won't be as nice as the stuff near the coast. Another obvious example would be growing acid-loving plants in high pH soils or vice versa. It's very expensive to change your pH in a large way, and so if your crop doesn't like that particular pH, you know, it's really not something you should mess with. Example might be we've tried growing peanuts here in our pH soils of 8.0. Peanuts like a pH of about 5.0. That spread is just too much for the poor little peanuts, I think. Also consider, are you going to grow crops that share many of the same pests? And you probably want to avoid that because they're just going to go from one crop to the other, and it's going to be more difficult with those pests. So your opportunities are what you can grow and what you can sell. So let's go to the next slide. As far as what we can sell, we need to choose a marketing system, and it breaks down really into just two categories. Are we going to grow a lot of crops, or are we going to grow a few crops? If we grow a lot of crops, our marketing system is going to be things like a community-supported agriculture, a farm stand, farmer's market, or multiple-level marketing where you do some of all these sorts of things, including retail sales and maybe some wholesale. You'll find that you end up growing a lot of crops to make that a profitable operation. Or you decide you're going to grow a few crops. And this is really everything else. It can be very small restaurant sales. So you could be partnering with a large vertically integrated company like Dole or Diorigo or any of those large grower shippers. But the choice of your marketing system has real implications on how things are going to go. Let's go to the next one. So here's some look at some advantages and disadvantages of these two systems. So if you grow a lot of crops, the advantages are less precision in timing, growing, and quality. So you can be a little lax with exactly when you plant and how you grow it and what quality you harvest. Because you have a lot of different things, there's less risk from crop failure. And it gives you some real flexibility in crop rotation, which is great for our long-term soil health. The disadvantages, generally you're going to have lower yields. You can't manage all these many crops perfectly. And this means you're going to have to put actually more money of input per dollars of output. So your costs are going to be higher. And this is something that farmers who are eternally optimistic, the extra management that you're going to require is really significant and really worth considering. You grow a few crops, it's certainly less chaotic, there's less management required, and cheaper inputs per output. But if you're going to grow a few crops, you got to be good. You must be above average in all aspects of the growing. So if you are an excellent grower, consider growing a few crops. If you're not such a good grower, but you're better at the marketing end and some of the other aspects, education, farm days, things like that, maybe that's not for you. And then the restrictive crop rotations of growing a few crops are really difficult. They tend to run right into organic regulations and organic philosophy pretty quickly. And of course, you've got a higher crop failure risk, which is well worth considering, especially when you're starting out. So very often you see people growing a lot of crops when they first start out to kind of put their toes in the water, and then they tend to either add crops and go into continue growing a lot of crops, or they tend to slim down and head towards growing a few crops based on their particular situation.
So this is going to be the first of many questions that we ask during this presentation. We're really hoping to get user participation and just you guys answering and asking questions for yourself rather than just listening to us present. So here are a couple questions relate to those first few slides. One of which is, who would you talk to in order to find your market, and what grows well in your area? And you can either chat with us using that question and answer box or the chat feature, and or you can raise your hand if you're calling in via our teleconferencing system, and I can unmute you and you can answer us on the teleconference. So does anybody want to share either via the chat function, question and answer function, and or using the raise your hand function, and I can call on you and you can speak to the rest of the participants in this webinar, answering either of those two questions. Again, the raise your hand feature is about halfway up that sidebar menu, and you can either use the Q&A function or the chat function to participate with us over here. So, or you can just make some notes where you are. Who would you talk to in order to find your market, and what grows well in your area? Just thinking about, before you get started on your crop planning, what you're going to need, the information you're going to need before you take off. All right, we have one chat in from Allison Charter-Smith, and she says, I would recommend speaking to other growers in your area to find out what grows well, what is missing in the markets, etc. So that's pretty exciting. I think that, Allison, I think you're right on. Do you have anything to say about speaking to other growers?
Yeah, I think that's really important, and you also need to speak to the people who are buying and find out what they can't get as well, and try and put those two together. But a lot of farmers will be very well aware of what's missing. They can't grow it themselves, and so they'll be more than happy to share that information with you. Seed company reps is another good people to talk to, because they go all over the place. They know what seeds people are buying and what they're not buying.
All right. Well, thanks for answering that, and we will move on to the next slide.
All right, so we've talked about opportunities, so now we need to figure out what the resources we have, and we're really trying to find what's special about us and our farm that is going to allow us to choose the right opportunity. So the resources we have are land and water. Let's see, I'm sure I get this right. Land and water management, labor, and equipment are our resources. So let's start with land and water. I don't know where everybody is calling from, but in California, land and water go together extremely closely. Common situation is plenty of land, but not enough water to grow everything you want. So you really need to figure out how much land you can actually irrigate. Are you going to run your pumps 24 hours a day, or are you going to run them 12 hours a day? If you run them 24 hours a day, what's going to happen in the middle of the night when something goes wrong? And there are very good calculators available with a web search. You'll be able to calculate just exactly what you can do with the water you have available for your land. Some crops can tolerate, not having quite enough water, things like tomatoes. Others try to grow broccoli with not quite enough water, and you have not quite enough crop. So it's really important to match your crop to its tolerance towards drought. Another thing about land is, especially here in California, we really need to double crop. Our land rents are high and our climate is good, and you need to leave enough time to prepare the ground adequately. And sometimes with organic production, this is really important because you want to do some things like stale bed weed control. You may have a cover crop where the residue needs to break down quickly. We don't have fungicides on our seeds, so if there's a lot of unbroken down residue when you plant seeds afterwards, you're going to get a lot of crop disease. So you got to leave enough time for that ground to be ready to be double cropped. Next slide. Management, labor, and equipment, the other parts to resources. Generally, most farmers start part-time, and it's really kind of a good thing to do because you almost need to avoid full-time until you're ready because you don't actually know what full-time management will be. And if you can keep your hand in another job, of course, you can keep the money flowing. And this is not something you can actually plan. It's something you will find out. And you really need to be aware of exceeding your capacity to manage your farm. And this, of course, comes to a real crunch at high summer when we're harvesting everything and we're still planting, and just a huge amount of time is required. A lot of the way people deal with management issues on farms nowadays is partnerships and trying to partner with someone who has the skills that you don't have in management. And none of us are perfect. And so that can really make or break a farm. I've seen it go too far where people have too many managers and not enough workers, so that we have to avoid as well. Labor, this is tough for smaller farmers because nobody wants to work for you unless they have steady work. So you need to be really creative. And there are, you need to have lots of jobs for people to do. You might need to share labor with another farm. You might need to share labor with a construction company. Who knows who you will share your labor with, but people need and want full-time work. And if you go to all the trouble of training someone, you don't want to lose them. I'm on any number of farms that I consult for who grow lots of things, and they just break even on them because they keep working. So it's not for profit. It's to keep your labor around. So let's see. Actually, let's go back to that slide still. I'll come to the next slide after this, but let's talk about equipment for a moment because it's also on this slide. So do you need anything special? And if you don't have the equipment that you need, you're really at a disadvantage. So, if you're an onion grower and you don't have an onion grater, or you're a potato grower and you don't have a potato digger, or if you're someone who needs to store their produce and doesn't have a cooler, these sort of equipment needs, which are fairly expensive, can make or break. So this will really, you may reconsider your crop choice if you can't get hold of the equipment you need to actually do what you want to do.
I had a couple of questions, Doug, just before we move on to the next slide. Somebody asked, how long do you allow for cover crop decay?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and it really depends on what you're going to do to incorporate that cover crop. So if you're going to manage it actively, which means that you're going through and stirring the ground up on a regular basis, you have irrigation water available to make sure that the soil stays moist so that breakdown can occur. You can turn a field around sometimes in the middle of the summer in 3 weeks. At the other ends of the season, we're looking at often 6 weeks. That's a lot of time to be paying rent for nothing in production, but you do get a bonus in your yield from taking care of the ground properly and incorporating the residue. So it actually all works out in the end. So somewhere between 3 and 6 weeks.
And is that dependent on heat or?
Yeah, if it's warm and moist, it takes less time. If it's cold and dry, if it's warm and moist, it takes less time. Cold and dry, it takes a lot more time.
All right. Okay, moving on.
All right. So this is a really important thing. This is what I talk to my students all the time is what are your special skills? Sit down and honestly evaluate your strengths and weaknesses because this is really where you're going to head with farming. do you have a keen eye for quality? If you do, maybe the San Francisco farmers markets and the Ferry Building are the place where you want to go. High-end stuff where you can actually figure out what the people who have the money really want to buy and match your crop to that. Good customer relations. Really important if you're running a CSA, if you're going to be interacting with people all the time. So, do you have good customer relations? And this is sometimes something that people have to honestly evaluate. Are you a great grower? Are you a really talented person with growing plants? And if you are, that's what you should be doing. Don't get all caught up in customer relations and all that other stuff. Find a situation where you can mostly grow. So really important to sit down with yourself and figure out who you are. All right, so the last part of this whole farm crop planning is planning for sustainability, which is soil health. Okay, so long-term sustainability. First of all, let's talk about what happens if you grow the same crop over and over. I'm sure you're aware of this, but let's run through it because it's really bad. Weeds and insects adapt and flourish. If they have the same thing to feed on every year or the same type of crop canopy, weeds and insects are absolutely in their element and they will flourish. This is somewhat reversible. As soon as you switch crops, you can start working on eliminating these weeds and insects. The other thing that happens is you get soil-borne diseases, and many of these are not easily reversible. Once you get them, once they get to a critical amount of inoculum in the soil, you may never get rid of them again. And so it's just so important to be planning to not have the same thing in the soil over and over so you don't get these soil-borne diseases. The other thing to consider is that if you work your soil the same way, you water it, you crop it the same way, your soil structure and your nutrients just diminish over time. And there's no way around that. You've got to mix it up. Also consider that it's illegal in organic to not be doing crop rotations. And then also, that's the stick, here's the carrot. You miss out on the cover crop benefits. So things like if you grow a high carbon producing crop such as oats, you get organic material, which raises your organic matter, which is good in many, many different ways. And if you grow a nitrogen fixing crop, you get nitrogen, which means you don't have to get out of a bag. So really important to, when you're working out your crop plan and thinking about all the crops you're going to grow, find space for cover crops and green manures, find space to think about how you're going to prevent soil-borne diseases from building up, how you're going to deal with weeds, soil structure, insects, all that stuff in your long-term sustainability.
All right, so we're going to move on to another question slide just to get your brains thinking over there in virtual Computerlandia. So just think about it for yourself and your operation. What's a core strength that you have, and how will that translate into what you choose to grow? So thinking about the special skills that Doug was talking about, what's one of those that you have, that you embody, and how is that going to transfer into, how you choose to make your crop plan? And then the second question we have is, what's your biggest soil health problem or worry? And again, you can either raise your hand using the hand raising button in that panel, or you can chat us. And just take it and either jot it down on a piece of paper at home or chat us and share with others, what you think your core strength is and how you're going to use that, or your biggest soil health problem or worry. And feel free to ask questions about soil health issues as well. And while people are writing those down, we did have another question just a bit ago. We have somebody writing in from Southern California who's looking for, who's in an area with not so many farms and is looking for places to find farm labor, experienced farm crews. And I don't know, Doug, if you want to field this, and or Ned, if you want to jump in and talk about how you have found experienced farm labor.
Yeah, Ned, why don't you take this one?
Okay. Well, it's great to be here. Really briefly, I've been fortunate enough to always be in an area with an abundant supply of farm labor, a lot of farms, and people always kind of looking for work and having that background and, being professional farmers. And but thinking about my next move, going to go to an area where there isn't a lot of agriculture, or traditionally there hasn't been a lot of market agriculture, more subsistence. So how is it possible to attract laborers? Thinking about what other industries people might want to transfer over to. from to agriculture, and what would I have to offer to attract somebody who has some skills. And I'm just still kind of thinking about that best way to do that. I know in the past when we've had a shortage and we've had something, something we had to pick or something we had to plan out or some big project, we'd often go to like the county job center where we could get folks that were interested in a day of work, and but that wasn't a long-term solution. So that's sort of what I have to offer off the top of my head.
Yeah, I've noticed that there's kind of a back and forth between people who work in construction and people who work in farming. And so sometimes, when construction is not so popular, farm work is more popular, and sometimes you might find, good people through construction companies who maybe have to lay off, and you can find people who work in farm labor that way.
And then we have a couple of other answers to the questions that are up on the screen right now. We had one user write in that her core strength is attention to detail and customer relations. And Doug, the presenter, mentioned that if you're better at growing crops versus, customer relations, and she mentioned that, she sells in farmers markets, and if you're selling in farmers markets and you're not great at customer relations, then you should hire a partner or somebody else who has those skills. And she said from experience that she's seen too many small farms at farmers markets who are really great at growing but not great at customer relations, and they suffer at selling at those markets, which is a great suggestion. And then we had another user write in who said that his greatest strength is that he's not afraid of hard work. I think Ned would probably agree that is one of your biggest assets going into this, profession. And then another user wrote in that their biggest soil health problem is not enough organic matter, since they have very sandy soil with low organic matter. Do you want to talk at all about that, Doug?
Well, that's really a rough one. It's very difficult, especially if you're in a warm temperature place, to really build your soil organic matter because in sandy soils, because everything you put in just really gets burned off very quickly. And so, doing your best to try to disturb the soil as little as possible. And sandy soils are good for that because the tillage is very easy. Your soil is very light. It's very easy to move. There's no reason to be using something like a rototiller or, equipment that just throws the ground up into the air. You want to just stir your soil very gently, and that will reduce a lot of the oxidation of your organic matter. So really, in sandy soils, I think it's mostly about the tillage. You got to do everything you can, cover crops, compost, things like that, to build the organic matter, but then don't lose it by stirring the soil up too much.
All right. So with that, I think we'll go back to Doug's presentation. Thank you guys for writing in.
Yeah, I just wanted to talk to the person who has the attention to detail. That's kind of my issue, and it actually prevents me from being a good farmer in some ways, because rather than doing just enough to get the job done, I will over-research and overthink things, and so I don't get as much done in a day. And so for people who have an attention to detail, it's very important not to get involved in an extensive farming operation where that is actually going to be a problem because you can't respond to shifting priorities as quickly as possible. So someone with attention to detail might want to find a good farmer who can take care of business and doesn't get caught in the minutia.
And then just before you go on, Doug, I had a couple more things, and then we'll take two more questions, and then we'll go in. So one is somebody wrote in that their soil issue is low organic matter, similarly, because they have many crops. They grow over 40 crops that have different nutrient needs. They cover crop during the winter, but at the end they feel that their soil is really tired at the end of the season before they go into cover cropping. Any suggestions on that one?
Yeah, I think that with growing that many crops, I'll talk about it actually in a moment here about grouping your crops together to try to avoid doing as little tillage as possible. And so maybe that will help you a little bit. And don't neglect compost, because that's a really that's a place where you can actually spread compost in very small areas and do it on a regular basis without having to go through all the trouble of preparing soil, planting seed, irrigating. Compost can go on at any time.
And then the last question real quick is somebody asked in, how do you plant a cover crop without tilling the soil?
Well, we do that actually quite a lot in the winter here in California with sturdy cover crops. Things like vetch and bell beans aren't real good because they're just a little too weak to handle it, but the grasses like oats and rye and stuff, sometimes you can mow the residue and then come in with something very light that stirs things up just a little bit and then come through with your grain drill. And a lot of the grain sits on the surface of the soil. Some of it gets buried too deep, some of it not deep enough. But because it's the winter time and it's raining, these crops can actually wend their way into the ground and they will come up. So, don't give up. The grains are very, very good at difficult soil conditions. So you don't need to spend a lot of time in tillage to plant grains.
All right, we'll go to the next slide.
All right, so thinking about, actually go back to the other one. So thinking about the things that I've learned over, many years of being on the whole farm type of crop planting, I don't actually do what Ned will talk to you about, which is the figuring out how many seeds you're going to plant per row and stuff. But I do a lot of figuring out, what we should grow and when. So I thought, what are my 5 tips that I could give to you that would be useful? So we'll run through those right now. So the first one is managing your resources optimally, which of course we all want to do. But what we want to do is we want to spread our harvest out as long as possible, but avoid a resources crunch, because when we have that resources crunch, things fall through the cracks and things can go wrong. So we want to consider our we want to make sure that we have as even a use of resources as we can. And so this means that we're spreading our harvest out as long as possible. But sometimes there are market issues that we might be able to take advantage of. For example, people selling at farmers markets who are growing a ton of different crops, they may not be the best tomato grower in the county. And so you might consider easing up in the middle of the main season when the people who are dedicated tomato growers, who have the best climates and soils and equipment, are in full production, because you can't compete with them. You may get, you may have a very hard time moving your tomatoes at that particular time. But what you can do instead is consider extra production at the beginning and the end. These large tomato growers, they need to have even production throughout. They can't really have bumps at the beginning and the end. So you can get in there with maybe having more production at the beginning of the season, more production at the end, and at this time your resources are more abundant and you maybe get a better price. So don't just plow on through with the crops that maybe you're the weakest in but you need to grow for a particular reason. Ease up on them when the people who are better than you at it are in the market. And to this end, consider things like season extenders and storage. This can really help you even out your production as long as possible. And then, to make sure that you have the even harvest and you're managing your resources optimally, you really want to have a lot of planting dates. But remember, each planting date you add is going to strain your resources. So you want a lot, but not too many. And you really have diminishing returns from each additional planting date. All right, so tip 2 is crafting a planting schedule based on how long a block will last, a block of whatever it is you're growing. And actually, this is really a harvesting schedule, not a planting schedule, as we'll see in a minute. So look at some different crops. We have radishes, romaine, cauliflower, broccoli, peppers, kale and chard, onions, potatoes, squash. So for radishes, we actually want a new block every 4 days. You can't hold radishes in the field. They crack, they get pithy, they get hollow, the leaves go bad. So you actually want to be harvesting a new block every 4 days. So if you're a radish grower, you can imagine a very intense planting schedule. Romaine lettuce, you probably want to be in a new block every 7 days because you can go over twice. You can do a double harvest. So every 3 or 4 days you can harvest. Cauliflower, broccoli, you might harvest those 2 or 3 times, maybe 4 times. So you can have a new block every 10 to 14 days. Things like peppers, kale, and chard, where you harvest repeatedly, you may get a new planting every 3 to 8 weeks. And then things like onions and potatoes and squash, where you might plant them only once per season, maybe a little more, but really you only have a few planting dates for that. So you can see that radish growers, very management intensive. Onion, potato, squash growers, maybe not quite so management intensive. Now, just because we want radishes every 4 days, does that mean we plant every 4 days? You know, choosing planting dates is art and science. And when I first started crop planting for, well, maybe 30 or 40 or 50 growers in the company I was working for, this was a huge issue because we didn't want to have too much at any one time, and we had all these different growers, and we had to coordinate planting dates. And it really is art and science because you can't actually design a crop planting schedule that will guarantee you your crops ready at exactly the time you want them. Crop maturity depends on a mix of day length and soil temperature with daily weather conditions on top of that. And an example would be, consider February and August. Okay, we have about the same day length, but if you plant romaine on February 1st and February 14th, it'll mature 7 days apart, which, as you remember, is what we wanted for our harvesting schedule. That's because of the cold soil. But if you plant on August 1st and August 4th, you'll also have that maturity 7 days apart because of the warm soil. So you can see that every planting date throughout the year is going to be slightly different, and if you want to crop every 7 days, you're going to need to change your schedule. You can't plant every 7 days. So this is a big issue. It's something that is a reward for farming longer and longer on the same piece of ground. You learn more and more about your particular system, and as a result, you have more and more consistent harvest. And so it's like getting a raise at a real job. Every year you get a raise, and every year you make more money. And so this is one of the benefits of being in farming for the long haul, is you get better at this. And this is a mixture of art and science. You can start out with like transplanting companies, like you know, around here we have places like Head Start and Green Heart and Speedlings. They have transplanting schedules that take into account the local conditions, soil temperatures, day length, all that for the particular area. So if you can get hold of a transplanting schedule, you can actually use that and modify it for what you're particularly growing.
And just as far as calculations on that, Ned's going to get more into detail on that later in the presentation, as we've gotten a couple of questions about how specifically to do that.
Yeah, so Ned will come and save me. All right, tip number 4, watch out for vernalization. And I'm surprised how many experienced farmers get caught by this darn thing. This is unwanted early flowering, and it's really crop specific, and it depends on the particular crop and sometimes the variety. So again, more experience, you'll be better at it. An example would be chard. Plant it in early spring, it goes to flower quickly, so you're done in 3 weeks. If you plant it in late spring, that particular crop might last 6 weeks or more. Parsley is kind of similar to chard. If you plant it in the fall and winter, you get a couple of cuts. If you plant it in the late spring and summer, you can harvest that thing 6 times. Cilantro, which is shown here, if you plant it in the winter and the fall, you might get 2 cuts out of it. If you plant it in the spring and summer, you just get 1. So it's really important to consider whether you have a crop that you can go back and get a second cut or not, and it really depends on the time of year and the particular crop. So that's really important. You have these chard gluts and chard deserts when you have too much or you have too little, and a lot of it has to do with a number of farmers not paying attention to how quickly things flower. And then my final tip is grouping your plantings for similar management. Now, it's really just more efficient and easier to work up large blocks, okay? So we want to have large blocks in our farm that are all ready to be worked up at a particular time. And so if we group things together so that they're all done at a particular time, that means that we're going to be more efficient. Things like using sprinklers, leveling ground, spreading stuff like gypsum, lime, compost, all much easier when you have a bigger piece. So we want to group things together. And this allows us to turn the ground faster. But really important not to overthink this. there are situations where you actually don't want to be doing that. An example might be upwind successive blocks can be better than gardens. I didn't explain what gardens are. Gardens are where you group the crops together that have the same day to harvest. So, but upwind successive crops can be better than these gardens for pest control and crop rotation. An example would be the crucifer brassica crops and cabbage aphids. If you plant your younger crops upwind, the aphids have a hard time actually flying into that wind and moving upwind, whereas your beneficial insects that are eating or killing or preying upon the cabbage aphids can move into the wind. So that can really reduce your cabbage aphid problem. So generally what we do is we group our minor low acreage crops together in a garden. Another issue would be that crops that are really susceptible to foliar diseases should have their blocks as far away from each other as possible. An example around here is cucumbers and downy mildew. It's a really virulent downy mildew race right now, and so the further apart on the farm we can space those blocks of cucumbers, the better. Another example would be carrots and alternaria. There's any number of things for which there are foliar diseases that in this particular point in time are really, really dangerous. We want to separate furrow and drip crops from sprinkled. Sprinkles always have some overspray, and when you get the ground wet where you want to work it, it's really annoying. So we often group things that are going to be sprinkled together and groups that are going to be, and things that are going to be furrow or drip irrigated in another spot. This is something that, again, is a little more art than science, and more experienced growers get better at grouping things together, figuring out what should be next to what. Whether they need to plant successive crops upwind, whether they can plant them in gardens. One of the nice things about gardens is there's so many things planted in there. When it comes to rotation, we usually don't even consider what was planted in there. We just rotate in with our next thing and kind of hope that we don't end up with the same thing on top of something else. And there's a little bit of planning that we can do to make sure that doesn't happen. But this is one of those things that experienced farmers get really good at and get compensated for.
So we're to our next question slide, folks, and again, you can just jot this down on a piece of paper at home, think about it in your head. How do you plan on varying your planting schedule to have an even harvesting schedule? And if you want to write in some type of question and or answer to this question, feel free to do that in the chat box. If you want to ask a question using your voice and you called in using the teleconferencing system, you can raise your hand and we can call on you and you'll be able to speak and people will hear you. And while you're thinking about that and writing in your questions and or answers, we did have a question that I'm gonna punt to Ned, and it is about somebody who has a 5-field annual rotation. Each field is half an acre, and one is always fallow. And this person was looking for some guidance as to which crops or families should not be grown together or successively planted. So I'm going to ask that to Ned about family groupings and what you generally have done.
Thank you. Yeah, that's a pretty large question, hard to answer briefly, but I think to get started, just like you just said, you want to think about what crop families you have and how can you block them together. And then depending on your markets, how do you plant out those half-acre fields? How do you block together your crops? What does your schedule look like? When do things go in the ground throughout the year? And you really just basically want to stick to families. And then you also need to think about what Doug said, the wind direction and where you plant things based on how pests travel. You'll probably want to think about your soil and any sort of disease that may be building up in parts of your rotation. And you also want to think about what you're going to do with that fallow field. How are you fallowing? What pest or disease cycle are you trying to break? What is your soil texture and quality and tilth? What are you trying to improve or change? And what are you trying to avoid? So it's sort of site-specific. You have to look at the history of the site, but you're definitely going to want to work out a many-year rotation where you we definitely move the families around as much as possible. And a lot of people say, well, I grow for a very tiny CSA. We have a little bit of about 50 different crops. I need to kind of all block them together, so I end up having 5 families all mashed up in one. How do I deal with that? You know, you're always probably planting a little bit more of certain crops like Doug talked about, onions, potatoes, maybe you have a big sweet corn block. You're always going to have a certain amount of blocks, and then your CSA mix, sort of the herbs and let's say, you know, brassicas and maybe you're doing lettuces and whatnot. They're all kind of mixed in together. You can sort of treat that as one, as a one group in your rotation, or you could actually even get down to splitting up each one of those half-acre plots into smaller little rotational areas where you get down to even beds or half beds. Kind of depends on that. So that would be my brief answer.
All right, thanks for that, Ned. And as there doesn't seem to be other questions about our last question slide, I'm going to pass it on to you, Ned, in general, if you just want to start off with your introductory slide.
Okay, thank you. It's great to be here. I just wanted to thank CCOF and Jesse for organizing this, and Doug for all of your expertise. And I'm going to try to build off of what has already been presented, and I'm hopefully going to start out, you know, just by talking a little bit about how I've farmed and what my goals have been, and then try to talk a little bit about the technical details of how do you decide what to grow, and then how do you make that really efficient, talking about your bed system, talking about how do you get transplants exactly when you want to put them in the ground, the question about how do you figure out different dates based on different times of year, vernalization, I'll talk a little bit about that, and then how do you make a detailed sowing schedule, and I'll also talk a little bit about a field map and what, how that can help, and just what that is. And I just want to say I'm definitely not a technical person. Don't have super savvy computer skills, but the Excel spreadsheets I'm going to present today are really simple, and the cool thing is once you make them, you don't have to redo them every year. You can just tweak them a little bit and kind of, like Doug was saying, sort of build your knowledge base for your site. So what we think about out in nature, you know, is sort of put the seed in the ground out in the field, and then it grows to harvest. And so start with seed, get a plant. But when you're doing whole farm crop planting, it's really good to think kind of backwards. You want to think about, or I like to think about, how much money do I want to make? What do I need to make to keep the farm running, to support my family or my lifestyle, or all the other responsibilities I have, labor or whatnot, your whole budget. So you know, you really want to think harvest backwards. So really you are making a harvest schedule. And that really, you know, starts with thinking about what are your sales projections and goals. So the CSA model is, you know, you really need to think about how many members you have, what the cost of the share or the box is, how many weeks your CSA will go for, and the number of items on average in your box or share per week. You want to think about farmers markets. How many farmers markets you want to do per week? What is the average income per market and per year? And what kind of crops do you think you could bring to market? Next slide. And then direct to retail and restaurants. What are you going to sell? What would you like to sell? What have people shown interest in? And how many sales per week or year are you hoping to make? You can kind of tag on your deliveries. Is your truck going to a certain place in town or around the state or wherever it is you're delivering to? Or, you know, is somebody coming to pick up? How can you consolidate that maybe with a farmer's market or a CSA drop? Wholesale. What's the number of boxes, pallets, truckloads of crops sold per week or per year? So if that's going to be part of your your mix, or if you're going to do any one of those solely, then you want to think about exactly how much you want to sell and then work backwards. There's a lot of different ways you can blend all of those markets. I ran a farm once when we grew specifically for CSA. So we really focused on CSA crops. We really focused on doing the best job we could, packing a really nice box. We grew a lot more of each crop, a certain percentage more for pests and disease, but also we would go to farmers markets. We did a little bit of direct resale in restaurants and wholesale if we ever had a bumper crop of anything. And that was a really nice way to kind of catch the planned extra and push it through our other outlets. And that way we basically could even out the crop planting throughout the season, and that worked really good up to a certain scale.
All right, so moving to the next slide. Again, this is another of those question slides. So thinking about what Ned was just talking about, what are you planning on growing for? Farmers market, CSA, wholesale, retail, I'm probably missing one, restaurants, other, and how do you plan on calculating that? How are you going to, get down into the weeds like Ned was talking about and, make an Excel spreadsheet of how many CSA members you're going to have, how many weeks it's going to be going, what you need, how much you want in the box, what the boxes are worth, etc. And just thinking for yourself how you plan on calculating that, or if you're already calculating that, and how you are doing so to, plan backwards, as Ned was talking about. If you want to share that with folks, feel free to chat in or send your questions if you have more technical questions through that chat response or raise your hand, and I'm happy to call on folks. And if I don't see any in a minute, I think I'll just progress, and then if you have questions, answers, we'll stop in a minute. All right, next.
Okay, so really it starts with collecting as much information as you possibly can on the types of crops that you grow. Maybe you've been farming for a long time, you have all this information in a whole bunch of different places, or you're just starting out, or whatever. You really need to consolidate all the information because there's a lot of information you need on all of the different crops, especially if you're really diverse. Maybe you only grow one crop, there's still a lot of information you need on that one crop. Different places you can find that, of course, in seed catalogs. Johnny's has an excellent little, they do a little sidebar of crop information under every crop seed that they sell. And you can also look at the Knott's Handbook for Vegetable Growers and other resources that will give you information such as what are the average yield for crops, what's the spacing each crop requires, and then they'll give you information on seed ordering, like how many seeds per ounce per pound, and then other specific production data. So you can basically start to create a master list or a spreadsheet of information that just gathers everything you need to know on any one crop, and from there you can then break out into other specific spreadsheets. So now we want to go to an example of do you want to go to seed varieties first, or master list?
I'm going to do a virtual trick here and pass the presenter tool over to Ned, and you're going to see his crop planning spreadsheet. All right, here we go. This is on purpose, folks. Okay, Ned. Should come up in a half minute. All right, we can see Ned's desktop. Go ahead and bring up that Excel spreadsheet, Ned.
Okay, it should be up. How would
All right, I can see it.
Okay, great.
Looking good.
Okay, so here's an example of a big old spreadsheet. Try not to pay attention too much to the details of the crops and varieties. They may not make any sense to you or to your specific farm, or they might. You're welcome to use any information that you see, but this is just an example of a large master list I've made or had help making with my farm partners this year on our on our farm project that we started up. And I just want to go down the rows and then talk about the different columns and the different crops and talk about all the information really briefly to show you what it is that I felt was really important to collect. There's a lot of it, so just bear with me. But we're going to talk about basil just because it's kind of a fun crop. Everybody knows basil probably, and it's got a little, kind of some funky things that will help illuminate some of the tricks of this list. So here's the crop, and then you can see the variety. We have 2 varieties of basil. We have 60-inch beds, so 5-foot on-center beds, and so for basil, we like to plant them 3 rows per bed. And usually we like to have full beds with 1 crop in them, but this year we're sort of starting out small. All of our beds are 300 feet, I should say. And so basil, we actually only want to plant half a bed. So half a bed, 3 rows, that's a total of 450 row feet. The spacing in row of basil is 12 inches. That means we need 450 seeds per sowing. And we determined that we want to plant them in the flat size of 192s. That means we need about 2.34 flats. That was the specific amount. We're going to round that up just so we can have full flats and be more efficient in our greenhouse. We propagate all of our starts. So we're actually going to end up with 3 flats, which is a really nice buffer if we have any pest or disease or any crop loss in the field or any sorting loss when we come into the packing house and we have to sort out stuff. Then we determined based on where we wanted to sell basil, how much, at what frequency, and how long basil would last in the field based on just crop knowledge and how we harvest it. Basil is one of those crops where you can do a tip harvest, you can do kind of cut and come again, you can do a thinning branch harvest, bunch, you can pull the whole plant up by its roots, kind of depending on what your consumer demands or finds attractive. You can pick it a whole bunch of different ways. For us, we decided 4 sowings, 4 plantings, and then we did some math, and that's 12 flats total. You can embed a formula in each one of these information areas, and the Excel will do the math for you, or you can just do the math simply in your head with a calculator or a computer, or however you decide you'd like to do that. Kind of moving over, we want to stay here on basil, but we have 12 flats, and our total beds for the whole season, remember we have 4 plantings, is 2 beds. This is the number of weeks between the sowings. That's how long we think a crop will last before we need to have another one coming on. Of course, it all will change slightly based on the time of year and the day length and your site and your season climate needs. And just because we're talking about that, someone asked, how do you determine that? How do you create the different date planting schedule for different times of year? Basically, like Doug said, you can talk to transplant companies, other farmers that have experience in your area. But the most important thing is to keep really good yearly records of when you plant and when you harvest. You're going to need to have those record keeping going on anyways if you're certified organic, or if you're just a good farmer. You really need to have as many records as possible, and it makes tweaking your planting, your crop plan in successive years that much easier. Okay, quickly we'll wrap this master list up. Now I'm kind of moving into the seed ordering part. Remember, I'm going to break this big master list down into other little spreadsheets as I go throughout my various farm tasks, but I've estimated that I need this amount of seeds, and then actual amount of seeds is 11,520. Why is that? We'll go quickly over here to the right, and we'll notice in the notes section that we put 5 to 7 seeds per cell. That's how we like to plant them out in multi-seeded cells, so there's many plants in one area. So that, with some quick math, brings us up to that many seeds. From our seed catalog, we can see that there's 320,000 seeds per pound. A little bit of math that gives us 0.036 pounds needed. Translate that to ounces. And then the source for this seed was High Mowing, so you can see from their catalog they offer it in 5-ounce increments. Here's their order number, the cost, and then the final thing that we wanted to put down here was when's our first seeding. And we worked backwards doing the math that I already showed you, and the information from the seed catalog based on our markets this year. Our first seeding should be on April 1st. And last thing I'll show you is we'll just go back, and you can see I have a lot of crops on this spreadsheet, alphabetized, and we also have flowers down here, and our big block crops as well, corn, potatoes, tomatoes, and winter squash are down on a separate kind of zone, but still on the same master list. Okay.
All right, Ned. So thank you. If you want to pass the ball back to me, so to speak, should be under Assign, Make Presenter.
Got it. Okay, passing.
All right, sounds good. And just as I'm getting back up and running, we did have a couple of questions. There are a few folks who would like to know if they would be able to get the copy of your Excel spreadsheet to fuss with and see if that type of Excel would work for them. Question for Ned?
That would be fine. Be happy to share that.
Okay. And another question, and this might also go to Doug, is wondering how to contact transplanters in their area about getting planting dates.
Yeah, I think it'd be hard to get one just given to you directly from a transplanter. You might need to get one from an experienced farmer who grows the particular crop, unless, of course, you were going to order transplants from that particular company, in which case you'd get a full schedule. And they'll work with you really closely on varieties and planting dates and numbers. So if you're going down the route of buying transplants, you can get that schedule easily. If you're not, and you just want the information, you're going to need to be more innovative about getting hold of one.
Yeah, and then there's another question about transplant calculators. I'm not quite sure what a transplant calculator is.
Probably similar to deciding when you're going to plant seeds, just how often you need to start your transplants to have them ready to then transplant at a particular time. So you can imagine that when you grow transplants, it's even more complicated than from seed, because you've got two planting dates, the one where you plant the seed in the greenhouse and the one where you plant the seed in the soil. And those are going to have different temperature, daylight influences on them. So you can see right away it gets fairly complicated. You can delve into too much detail or not enough, and you need to get some preliminary information from an experienced person, whether it's another farmer or an actual transplant company, I think, to really start going on that.
All right. And again, we will send you a copy of that Excel spreadsheet in the email follow-up after this webinar. So don't worry, you will get it, and you can check it out on your own. All right. Ned, do you want to talk about determining seed varieties?
Yes, definitely. That's a really important part of your marketing mix is growing unique, interesting, good-tasting varieties. Also, varieties can confer disease resistance, and certain varieties are more adaptable to your climate than others. And also you want to think about different varieties as far as what sort of uniformity they offer and out in harvesting. And if you're doing a certain particular packing and you need to, and you're wholesaling or sending something on the road, how does it travel? Or what does it look like at your fresh market, farmer's market, or in the store? Does it stand out? Does it look beautiful? And then you want to think about the cost. Certain varieties cost a lot more, kind of depending upon their availability. Also, if they're open pollinated or hybrid varieties. And then the last thing I'll say, which kind of on this topic, which relates to the planting calculator, is there are a lot of online sort of equations that you can use. Johnny's Seeds has some calculators. You can plug in numbers, and they'll kind of put out dates for you throughout the season based on how many planting dates you want. But it's really hard to get it for your specific site. I know I was farming in an area where we were 2 miles away from a different farm, but we were at the top of a valley. They were at the bottom of the valley. The planting and growing conditions were totally different. There's no substitute for just taking notes and having the experience, or begging and maybe like baking some cookies for your local your neighbor, and to see maybe if they will give you a little bit of their hard-earned information. But it really it can even get down to the varieties of certain crops that will change throughout throughout the season. A sweet corn planted early, mid, or late definitely will ripen at a different time, for an example. So really thinking about your varieties and how they change your harvest schedule is really important.
Yeah, I apologize for the technical glitches there. I know you guys can see both of our presenter slides and our regular slides, and we are working on that issue over here. But going on, I just wanted to remind folks that there are pretty specific NOP rules for seed and planting stock resources. It must be organic seed unless organic seed for that thing you're trying to grow specifically is not commercially available. And if you're interested in finding out more about the organic rules, you should check out the seed form that's here hyperlinked within the presentation. There's a lot of information about that on the CCOF website, what is and what is not allowed as far as seed sourcing in organic regulations. A potential resource for folks is this website, Organic Seed Finder. It's still in the beta form, and we hope that they will improve it over time. But if you're looking for organic seeds specifically, you can check out this website and see if it'll help you find varieties and where specifically you can buy them. All right, Ned, back to you.
Okay, excellent. So in a perfect world, your farm looks like that picture on the bottom right. Straight, long rows, perfect germination, in a big block. It's exactly, every bed is exactly the same length, and everything's very uniform. So imagine that you're able to do that. You want to really think about how can I make my bed lengths the same. It just makes seeding, irrigation, cultivation, and harvest that much more efficient and easy. And then you want to think about how many lines per bed for each crop. Do you have, does it need a lot of space? Are you going to plant one line or two or three, or how wide is your bed top? And then how much space in line for each crop? Do you need, are you growing carrots where they're 1 inch apart, 3 inches apart? What's the spacing that'll tell you how many seeds you need per foot or per bed, and then that'll tell you how many plants you need per bed and per crop. And with all this information, you can plug it into your master list. And then finally, you want to make sure you have enough crops and that you're always planting a little bit more, so you can avoid not making your contracted sales, or not filling out that farmer's market stand, or not filling out those CSA boxes, or whatever you're wherever you're selling. So can you round up? Can you plant an entire bed? Can you finish off that block with the same crop, or can you round down? Do you need actually a bed, 1.2 beds of beets to make it through the season or to make it through the month? Can you round down, just have one full bed of beets, and figure out how to bring in other crops? Just making your bed system efficient will really help you determine how much of what you need. Okay, so determining specific production goals for each crop to be grown. This, like I said, is really important to have records from previous years. So you really want to take a look at what has grown in the past. And first question, how much of each crop do you need to harvest and at what frequency? Doug kind of covered a little bit of this, but how much of any one crop are you really wanting to get out per week? How many pickings do you have per week? Do you pick every day? Do you pick twice a week? How many markets are you going to? Are they evenly spaced out throughout the week? Do you pick once a week for a big CSA delivery? Those kind of questions. And how long do crops hold in the field? How do they keep their quality over time? Doug covered that as well a little bit. But what is the length of harvest period for each crop? You really need to know that so you can plan your succession plantings. Okay. Questions, I guess.
All right. Thanks, Ned.
Yep.
So getting into the weeds here a little bit, getting your brain fired up as you're thinking about it. What is your current bed system and how are you planting into it? And thinking about creating your bed system ahead of time or altering it so that you're on one major system or two major systems so you don't have to keep changing equipment. And how well does it work for you? If people have questions about bed systems or they want to share what they're currently doing, feel free to raise your hand or put a question or answer into the chat box. And as folks are doing that, I had another suggestion from a listener as far as determining what to grow in your area, which is asking a neighbor, yes, which Ned said, and then also asking your customers what they like. Taste is huge, allowing customers to really inform what it is that you plant more of. And then there's a couple of other questions about seed ordering. Ned, these are for you. Somebody asked where Johnny's is based, which I'm not sure.
Maine.
Oh.
But they have a California rep, and they have one right here in our area in Santa Cruz, in Salinas, Monterey.
Yeah. And then the other question is, Ned, have you ever heard of Ag Squared or used Ag Squared?
Ag Squared, that's familiar, but no, I've never used it.
And Doug, have you ever heard of the resource Ag Squared?
No.
Yeah. Sorry about that. We do not have resources on Ag Squared, but I believe that it's a calculation site where you can put in what you're going to grow, and they'll help you figure out how to calculate what you need to put in.
There actually is another resource put out by the Canadian organic growers called Crop Planning. I think that's the book. It's about $25, and it has a lot of the charts and spreadsheets and things that Ned's been talking about that I believe you can either make your own or print out theirs.
Yep, and then we had another person write in that Ag Squared is available through Johnny's. So that's another resource for folks if they're looking it up. All right, moving right along here. Ned, we're going to go to the greenhouse production.
Sounds good.
So we're going to go back to that Excel spreadsheet here.
Okay.
And just taking a minute. Here we go. So again, folks, you will get a copy of this in your email after we are finished.
Excellent. So, good. This is like my version of Ag Squared, it sounds like, which is fun because you can kind of make your spreadsheets however you like to look at them. we actually have several versions of this greenhouse sowing collated on, based on whatever it is you want to look at. You want to look at the crop, you want to look at the date, you want to look at, there was even another way that we organized it. But anyways, you can play around with this based on how your brain works. But I want to just kind of go over this information. I took a lot of information out of that master list that we looked at and put it in the greenhouse sowing schedule. This is the literally piece of paper which lives on a clipboard, which lives in the greenhouse or in the propagation shed or wherever it is that you're making potting mix, filling flats, and sowing. Maybe you're not growing your own transplants, but if you are, this can live out there. And take a look at basil again. The first thing is you really want to calculate the number of plants per sowing to meet the harvest goals. Again, we wanted to have half a bed at 3 rows per bed, and we knew we wanted to plant them at 12 inches apart, so that's 450 row feet and 450 seeds per sowing. And you want to think about what is the average yield per plant or row or bed. What is the average yield of basil per plant? That's pretty easy to calculate. For example, if we're pulling the entire plant out with roots and all and selling it like that, that would be 450 plants. Or because, remember, basil we plant 5 to 7 seeds per cell. We still want to pull that entire cell kind of out of the soil, so it's still 450 harvest units. How many plants or rows or beds are necessary to meet the defined harvest requirements? So let's say we're only going to do 4 plantings of 450 plants for this year, and we have an order for 450 units 4 times throughout the season. So that's one way we could have calculated that. That's not exactly what we did. We were selling more throughout the season, kind of a fresh market style. So we just kind of determined this is how many bunches we can pick. This is how long the basil lasts, and this is when it gets tired, and we need another planting to be coming on. You really want to make sure, as I talked about before, you're adding a certain percentage more for loss due to greenhouse failure, pest or disease, and other field-related issues. So we needed only 2.3 flats, I think, but now we're planting 3 flats, so it's quite a bit more. And then you want to kind of look at what are the specific sowing dates throughout the season that are needed to achieve your harvest goals that you established. And you want to, how do you make these? Kind of that's the big question. How do you know when we're going to put that crop in the ground? So I'm going to get it in, 35 days from right now. And it's really an art and a science. You need to really consider the days to maturity, what your seed catalog tells you, or your seed rep tells you, or your farmer friend tells you, your first and last frost date, if that affects your area. How long does a crop hold in the ground before it declines in quality? So you have a certain window. And you really, again, I can't emphasize this enough, keep good records to accurately record the days to maturity for your specific region and season and variety. And then if you're planting more than one succession, you want to determine when the next succession goes in based on all that crop info, and then what are the total number of sowings needed. Be aware of vernalization and the change in day length and soil temperature and how that slows down or speeds up the maturation of your crop. And the last thing you want to do or can do with greenhouse sowing schedule is you can calculate the seed costs and make a seed order. It really helps you bring together exactly how much you'll need of each variety. You can even have another column where you make notes on, okay, they're out of this variety, went to this variety, or tried to find it, organic in these different places but couldn't. It's really nice to be able to have a little note place on this. spreadsheet.
All right. Thanks, Ned.
Yeah.
All right. So just coming back into the presentation outside of the Excel spreadsheet, which I know everybody's pretty excited about. A note on transplants. They also need to be certified organic. All your annual transplants need to be certified organic. So make sure when you're looking to order transplants that you get the paperwork. Again, this information is definitely available on our website. So you can go to ccof.org and you should be able to see to find information about transplants. Feel free always to give us a call as well if you're confused about something or you're not sure if one person or another has or one company or another is certified organic. Feel free to give CCOF a call and we can help you figure that out. All right. Going back to Ned, we're going to show your field map here, and I'm going to share. So Ned, do you want to talk about the importance of making a field map?
Sounds good. Yeah, kind of one of the last things I want to talk about is again, getting a piece of paper and writing down a field map, creating a literal representation of your field, so you can so that part of your brain gets turned on. If we look at this field map, you can see here are single plantings kind of field map, and this kind of represents the bigger block plantings that we've had this year. And you can see at the top there's the different numbers corresponding to the bed feet. All of our beds are 300 feet. And then, again, the varieties may or may not make sense to you, so try not to focus too much on that. But we planted half a bed of red onions and half a bed of shallots. And we know what spacing we put our red onion starts at, and we also know how many lines are on our bed, and so we can basically calculate just kind of in our brain really quick, okay, 150 bed feet of red onion, those varieties, I know I'm going to need this many plants, kind of already starting to think about that when creating that master list. You can also make little notes out on the side for lines of a certain kind of onion, and then open. That just means we have an open bed there for irrigation needs and cultivation needs and various other needs. Yeah, you can go down a little bit, and then potatoes. That's our big block of potatoes, that many beds, and you can have a map like this for each one of your fields. Make notes on it like bad pests here, we've got terrible bindweed in this area, and this really helps you kind of visually see your farm and what happened where, and then this will really help you with crop rotation even and planning for the future. And just wanted to mention that this doesn't have to take that much time. You can have a base a base spreadsheet, and you can just draw into that and keep this on another clipboard, literally another clipboard in your office, and take it out with you to the field each time there's a planting, or each time you're working up the ground, or each time you're working on your field.
All right, thanks, Ned. Well, rounding the bend here, folks, we're just going to keep going, and I wanted just to mention that there's a space here for additional questions. If you have questions, feel free to input them into the questions box, and/or feel free to raise your hands. And I have a question here, Ned, about can you share this PDF also of your field guide, and are there other places to perhaps make field planting guides like this? And I don't know, Doug, if you have additional resources as far as creating field maps for folks.
I would be happy to share this field map. We created this based on some other farms and farmers I've worked with, and was just a really basic basic formulation, yeah, maybe Doug has some other ideas around that.
Yeah, I don't know what to say. I think if you were to if someone was not real tech savvy and actually started to write down on a plain piece of paper what they exactly wanted to do, they could then take it to someone who is good with these spreadsheets. So I think we really quickly design a custom one for you. You just have to be clear of what you're hoping to get out of it, and you can start writing it down, and then all the calculators and stuff can be superimposed afterwards. So you can actually start out with something pretty simple and turn it into something that's custom pretty easily, I think.
All right, and then just coming around, if you guys are interested in organic certification and you're not yet certified, CCOF definitely has resources for folks and people to talk to. So you can call our office at 831-423-2263, and the extension you'd want to call at that point is 43. Jane Wade is a really long-time CCOFer, and she's got information about certification. She can answer all your technical questions and how much it's going to cost, and et cetera, et cetera. And we'd be really happy to talk to you about the process and or questions you have specifically about your operation and different pieces of it as you go into crop planning. We are going to send you resources via email. We're also going to send you a survey. We'd love if you could fill out our educational survey. And you can check out our upcoming education events at our education page. We have a couple other questions. One was about the Bagrata bug. Wondering, Doug, if you have any resources about the Bagrata bug. There's some people in Southern California on this call, and they're wondering if anybody has some success stories with control or management of that.
Yeah, unfortunately, I just saw my first Bagrata bug about a month ago, and it was on some experimental radishes that Seeds of Change, I think, was trying on one of the farms. And we just came in and we took our propane burner and we burned all the radishes and all the Bagrata bugs as soon as we saw them. So that's as much as I know. But let's see, there's going to be an update with our local farm advisor in December on the Bagrata bug, which I'm going to go to. And you could plug into our Salinas Valley Cooperative Extension Service. They have a blog, which is really good, and every time they see something new or find out something new about a new pest, they post it on there. So I definitely recommend getting their vegetable growers blog. That might be helpful, but I don't have anything more than what I saw.
Can you describe what they look like?
You know, the annoying thing about them is they're quite small and they're fairly easy to miss, but they're a true bug, so they look like a stink bug, but they're a particularly small stink bug, and they're kind of brown with little gold flecks on them, and they really love things in the radish family.
We have one person who wrote in that said you got to crush them early in the morning when they're sleepy, and they've observed birds eating them. They really love kale and arugula.
The good thing for us as organic growers is very often a new pest like this will come in, it will cause a stir, and it will continue to be a problem for conventional farmers, but over time, you know, beneficial insects will very often take care of it. We don't worry too much about our light brown apple moth anymore, and just 5 years ago it was going to ruin agriculture in the area.
Yeah, so we did have somebody write in. Ann Bayer from NCAT and ATRA has put together some great resources and information. And for those of you guys who aren't familiar with NCAT, the National Center for Appropriate Technology, and ATRA, they are doing some amazing things, and they have great technical resources for farmers. They also have an Ask an Expert part of their website, which I highly recommend. So you can, I'll put that in the email as well for folks. You'll get a copy, you'll get a linked copy that's a recording of this presentation. You'll get Ned's Excel spreadsheet that you can copy and paste and tweak, as well as his field map, and I'll send a link to the Ask an Expert part of the NCAT page, as well as some information about Ann Bayer's work. All right. So I think that that's it, unless there's any more questions. That's my contact information up on the screen. If you have additional questions, feel free to send me an email and or give me a call, and we would love to hear from you. So thank you guys for being on the line today. And thanks again to Ned and Doug for providing all that technical expertise.
Thank you.
Thanks.
All right. Take care, guys.